The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Today I want to walk through that case, in quotes. It's more of a teaching note than a case, but there are some questions to talk about. And let me pose one that probably occurred to some of you as you began reading that case. Why are we talking about EPA at the front of a case on energy? Sam.
Causes pollution, and especially it can depend a lot on where your energy comes from. Like the article talked about how coal causes like a lot more CO2 emissions than other sources.
So on the one hand, energy is a source of the kind of pollution EPA was created to deal with, and on the other hand?
Also, the different regulations impact current and future production trends.
So a lot of energy policy is made under the umbrella of environmental policy. Plus or minus coal is not going to be about coal, but it's going to be about not going to be about energy, it's going to be about the environment. Let me call your attention, this was an optional reading, but that National Academy of Sciences Unpriced Consequences paper is probably the best recent summary of this literature, and it talks about putting climate to one side. We'll come back to that. It credits coal-fired power plants in 2005 with $62 billion worth of damages. Externalities, unpriced consequences, with a huge range per kilowatt hour in the damages caused by individual plants. Natural gas-fired power plants, much less in aggregate, and in fact, much less, except for a few cases, per plant. Transportation, both light duty, cars and light trucks, and heavy duty, heavy trucks and equipment, add up to about $56 billion, not that far off coal-fired power plants. The other interesting thing, and we'll come back to this later today, there's a parenthetical assessment where they look at alternative forms of transportation, alternative power trains for cars, and they conclude that electric vehicles are worse environmentally than diesel, which in turn is worse than gasoline or ethanol. And the reason is, of course, electric vehicles across the country are half coal-powered, because that's where the electricity comes from. And this sort of gets lost in the discussion. But, there are these numbers. Where do they come from? Where do you think they come from? $62 billion is not peeling paint. $62 billion is mostly valuing premature mortality, i.e., people die. There's a little bit of health effects. People get bronchitis. But mostly, those numbers are from people dying. How would you do that? Does it make sense to compute numbers like that? Does it make sense to use numbers like that? How would you use numbers like that? Do you believe numbers like that? And people say all the time, there's $62 billion worth of damages. Putting a price on human life? Putting a price on risk? What do you think? You read that, what's your reaction? How about a reaction? Max, you got a reaction?
Probably the cost of medical expenses associated with it.
That'd be one way to do it, but that's not usually how they do it. See, if you do that, you can come to the conclusion that cigarette smoking is terrific because people die at a younger age if they smoke, and therefore they don't have the long care costs of people in their 80s or 90s because they don't get to their 80s or 90s. So that's you can measure costs of sickness sometimes that way, but not death. Not death. Anybody else? Julian?
The
what would be their contribution to the GDP and like their economic contributions towards the economy?
That's one way to do it. Do you like that? You could do it that way.
I would try and take all of their economic impact, including like the health costs, like their contribution to the tax base, but how much they cost in taxes.
So basically retired people, and this is beginning to bother me, retired people should have a negative value, right? Because they're drawing down Social Security, they're drawing down Medicare, they're not working, just gone. So that method's been used. It does have that consequence I just described, but for working age people, and sometimes that's done in court cases. So someone is killed by negligence and you sue, and what do you get? Well, one way that's sometimes calculated is, well, how much money would, the wife sues, the husband was killed at work, the wife gets the husband's lifetime earnings, expected lifetime earnings. That isn't what they do here, because a lot of this is mortality of older people, and you don't want to come up with a negative number. The way they do it, I mean, just because it's a little bit of a puzzle. The way they do it is they look at, at least recently, you look at wage premiums for risky jobs. So you say, how much more does it take to persuade somebody to be a welder underwater, which is a bit hazardous, than to be a welder on land? And a number of kind of calculations like that. Because you're not actually valuing a death. When you do these studies, you're valuing an increase in risk. So you increase the risk of death. And you say, all right, well, in the marketplace, what are people willing, what does it require, what do you have to pay people to get them to assume an increased risk of death in certain settings? And then you play with that for a while, make some assumptions, roll it around, and say the value of a premature death is $6 million, which is a round number that's used. And then you say, okay, we look at how many people we expect will die early because of small particulates from coal-fired power plants, and we value that at $6 million apiece. So you're not valuing a death so much as you're valuing an increased risk of death. So that's how you do it. Should you use numbers like that to make decisions? There were some readings on whether cost-benefit analysis is ethical, and some of it comes to that.
Just a personal opinion, I think not really. I mean, I wouldn't pay too much attention on like the very specific value per se. What maybe would be indicative for me at least would be like relatively. So like judging, since they're the same basic assumptions made for any different source, meaning coal or natural gas, maybe I would see these values relatively. So if it's much higher for coal than for natural gas, that would just give me an indication between the two, but I wouldn't do like a whole analysis saying, okay, it's $6 million here and $6 million there, so like it get canceled, so I'm okay. I mean, I think
but you got to know something about not just relative, but absolute to know whether it matters. If I told you the damages were $5 from coal-fired power plants and 35 cents from gas-fired, that wouldn't affect any decisions. If I told you it was 500 billion versus 200 million, that would drive a decision. So I take your point, but sometimes you got to have a sense of the absolute, not just the relative.
If I just may
of course.
Is there any sense at least of like error or like a band for a race number of these?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, all this stuff is subject to error. Take coal-fired power plants. Take a particular plant. First thing you're doing is you're estimating where the stuff from that plant goes. Okay, so that's a transport model of one kind or another, which is averaging over a bunch of weather conditions. And then you're using, and there's error there, and because you can't measure that well. And then you're using a dose response curve based on a number of different kinds of studies to say if this area gets this kind of particulate concentration over this period of time, oh, by the way, how much time do people spend outside breathing it versus inside, et cetera, then we would expect this increase in the risk of death for people in this age bracket. Sure, there are error bars. You don't see them, but there are pretty good size error bars. In fact, critics say they're very wide error bars. And similarly, the human life, even the people who do this stuff, you're comparing a risk voluntarily assumed with a risk imposed. How many of you ride motorcycles? How many of you have ridden on a motorcycle? This is a risky activity. This increased your probability of death significantly. You didn't think about it. If I told you, however, we were going to pump poisonous gas into your room that had the same effect, you'd go crazy. People distinguish between risks they choose to assume and risks that are imposed, and I don't know how to value that. So, you had a comment? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's useful for like bringing attention to an issue rather than decision making. Because the thing is, like when they come to policymakers, they want a number that they can associate with the issue.
Actually, policymakers tend to hate this stuff because there is this valuing human life aspect.
When you go through like all the different steps, like you go through all their inputs, all the assumptions, they don't want to go through all that. They want to compare like numbers, what it comes down to.
Well, as we'll see in a second, distinguish different kinds of policymakers. But people who are looking for votes do not like to say a human life is worth $6 million or say anything that sounds like a human life is worth $6 million because it's priceless. Saying it's priceless doesn't get you a decision unless you can make some other assumptions, which they did.
Well, when they use that number, right, they don't publicize the fact that it is value statistical.
I mean, every administration, every presidential administration since, depending on how you think about it, Carter, but certainly since Reagan, Republicans and Democrats have done this kind of analysis quietly. Quietly. Okay. Anything else? Yes?
I had a quick question about the electric vehicle statistic.
Yeah.
Is that based on electric vehicles that are only run off coal-fired plants, or is that all electric
It
vehicles?
assumed the average generation mix, I think. You can go back and check, but I think that's what it said. That assuming the average mix, which gets you about half coal, ballpark, yeah.
Just to confirm, they did not price carbon when looking at it.
Not in those, they didn't. There's a discussion, again, you can look at it, of relative carbon emissions, right? And coal gives you about twice per kilowatt hour what gas gives you in terms of carbon emissions. And they talk a little bit about transportation. No, I guess we won't. I was going to say we will come to some discussion of pricing carbon. The Obama administration has an official value for carbon emissions that it uses for internal decisions. It sounds like a reasonable number, but it rests on weak foundations, because we'll talk about this, but trying to understand the magnitude of climate damages in a century and discounting it back is a difficult exercise. Okay, let me move along. I want to talk about this property rights analysis because I think it's useful to think about. There are those people who actually said that, well, you really don't need this kind of government interference. You could just assign property rights to either have, say, clean air or clean water, or property rights to dump pollution and let the market sort it out. This is the so-called Coase theorem. And the example that's given in the Viscusi, et cetera, reading is this one. You have a mill, you have a river, and you have a town. The mill dumps pollution into the river. The town takes water out of the river. There's $500 worth of damage. Okay, so drinking the polluted water or using it to wash clothes or whatever causes $500 worth of damages. The mill could clean it up for $100. The town could treat the water for $300. The argument goes, there is no problem here, we just need to assign property rights. Suppose you say that the town is entitled to clean water. The town is entitled to clean water. The town takes legal action against the mill. The mill spends $100 and cleans up. Simple. Suppose the mill is entitled to pollute. Give them the property right. Then what happens? The town could clean up for $300, but what would most likely happen is they go to the mill and say, look, we'll pay you something over $100 to clean up, something between $100 and $300. Right? You're not going to pay them more than $300 because you could do it yourself. They're not going to take less than $100, so there's some bargaining room. You're going to get rid of the damages either way because it's cheaper to get rid of them than to bear them. And either way, what happens is the mill cleans up. In one case, the mill pays. In the other case, the town pays. But in both cases, the mill cleans up, the pollution goes away, and all you had to do is assign property rights. So, first of all, are there questions about that? Does that little example make sense in its own terms? Yeah?
Why does the mill need, like if the mill is polluting, then they're sort of claiming those rights anyway, right? The right to pollute. So
Well,
the town pay them.
we have that happen at the outset, and then we establish property rights. Then we establish property rights. So this is the status quo before we put the law in effect, and what the law says is instead of yelling at each other, one of you has the right to enforce action against the other in court. So either the town can force the mill to clean up, or the mill can do whatever it wants unless it's bribed or paid. So we start out with a situation in which there are no property rights. The mill is polluting, the town is complaining. We assign property rights, the problem gets solved, is the argument. Either way, we assign them.
Are property rights necessary for the town to clean up the water? Because if it's just everyone's river, then they want water.
Well, if the town, I mean, you could imagine what property rights determine here is who pays, basically. Because if what you're saying is if you don't have property rights, the town's going to go up here and try to bargain. Because you're saying implicitly, unless you do something, the mill just pollutes. Well, that's equivalent to saying the mill has the right to pollute. If the mill has the right to pollute, then the town is going to have to pay them not to. If the town has the right to clean water, then the mill's either going to have to clean up or pay the town to clean up. It's cheaper for the mill cleans up. So if you say, you know, the mill's just going to pollute, not if the town can stop it. Not if the town can stop it. That comes to the next question is, why won't it work? One reason it might not work in a real life case is the town doesn't happen to have chemists and doesn't realize that the water's dirty. So you might want to say, gee, a role of government is to do some science here, at least, and figure out what's going on, to do the studies of damages. I want to make sure everybody's got the example before we go to run down this list a little bit. But are you on the example, or are you on why it might not work?
I'm kind of on the example. I was just wondering, like, how do you decide who gets the property rights?
The point, Kosa's point is it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters from the point of view of fairness, maybe. You might say it's fair to have the polluter pay. But Kosa's point of view is you clean it up either way. His example was, in fact, a train, and this was a coal-fired steam engine running by a farmer's field. Sparks come out of the smokestacks, sparks start fires. The farmer can put out the fires, or the railroad can clean up the smokestack. Whoever has the property rights are going to get the lower cost alternative done. But
one thing with that, so even with that scenario, or with the mill scenario, even if the mill had property rights, then wouldn't the town want to bribe them, like either way, whether or not
exactly.
they had property rights?
If the mill, well, if the town has property rights, it doesn't have to bribe; it can compel. Okay. It'll bribe if it has no alternative. That is to say, if the mill has the right to pollute, then it'll have to bribe. If the town has the right, it can sue, it can compel. So, yeah.
He's also assuming the cost of damages is greater than the implementation cost. Like the 500 is greater than the 300, which may be correct
true
99% of the time, but
no, yeah. If I make this 50, then nobody cleans up. Yeah. Right? If that's $50 worth of damages, then the mill has the right. The town isn't going to spend $100 or more to save itself $50 worth of damages. And if the town has the right, well, that's actually an interesting question. If the town has the right to clean water, in that case, would it compel the mill to clean up? I think you get the bargain going the other way. You get the bargain going, you've got the right to clean water, the mill pays them $60 to accept the damages. The mill covers the cost of the damages. Because the efficient thing in this case is not to clean up. Assuming, this is a number that makes some sense. Okay. Anything else on this? Okay. Why do we need EPA? Why don't we just do this? One answer is, there's an information problem in a lot of these areas. So maybe a role of government is to do the science, tell people about it, make sure the town knows, make sure the mill knows. Maybe even work on cleanup technologies, all perfectly sensible things. And then assign property rights, right? Yeah.
Really complicated, say if you had like 5 mills ahead of the town and they're all polluting, and then you have the case like where one mill says it pollutes less, so it should have to clean up less, and then it's just a huge argument over monetary value.
And let's suppose we have 6 towns. Okay, so you can have, so let me just write a little bit. The first thing we talked about that made the cameras move, first thing we talked about was information. And the second point here is number of players. There's just a whole lot that comes under that heading. If you think about applying it to air pollution, so there's a coal-fired power plant in Salem, Massachusetts. The coal-fired power plant in Salem, Massachusetts is dirty. Everybody in Salem and around Salem gets affected to some extent. How does this work? I give every person property rights? And how do 20,000, 30,000 people act collectively? Sue in court. So when you have more than these simple examples, it gets to be hard. And the other one, just to fill it out, is just transactions costs. In a world in which everybody is suing everybody else one way or another and bargaining over cleanup costs, that's a world in which a lot of money is spent doing that. So the usual argument here is, well, this is a lovely exercise, and it does make a good point, I think. But frankly, when you go to the real world, you need different mechanism to deal with externalities. So that's an argument for involving the government. It's not necessarily an argument for involving the federal government. Before 1970, most states had environmental agencies. Why do we need a federal agency? This is a cue for all the Republicans. Go ahead.
If one state decides that it's okay to pollute a lot, that can be in the atmosphere and affect the states that border.
So pollution crosses state lines, absolutely. Anything else cross state lines, David?
I was going to say pollution crosses national lines too, so.
We'll see when we talk about acid rain, we'll see that pollution crossing the Canadian border turned out to have an important implication. It does cross national lines, but since we don't have a world government, having a world pollution agency is not an option, although there are international agreements. The Montreal Protocol that phased out ozone-depleting chemicals was an example of exactly that. People got together to solve a global problem. Climate change is harder. Brendan? Electricity crosses state lines, so what you're saying is you could generate in some place that's dirty and sell to some place that's clean and disadvantage the entities in the clean state. Anything else? Ryan?
Well, there's not only like air pollution, but there's also like river pollution and something that's polluted in the Mississippi River. But also like if you, I don't know if this is necessarily the case, but if you like mine in one state and there's the, it gets dirty from the mining and then you sell it to a different state, there's like some sort of a transaction there.
There's a transaction there. Anything else you might worry about? If you're a clean state that you might worry about? Yeah, Max.
I mean, it's an economic thing. So if you have one state that decides that they're going to deregulate and allow pollution to go, it essentially becomes a tax haven for corporations, and states that are clean become economically poor because corporations can die.
The fear that everybody has is jobs. Is that you'll basically be, Mississippi decides that it really needs jobs. It's a low income, low wage state. So apart from being tough on labor unions, it's also going to be real easy on pollution. And everybody in Mississippi says, well, I don't like to breathe that air, but I'd like to have a job. And you have a race to the bottom, so to speak. In pollution, it's a worry, whether it happens or doesn't happen. It's a worry that you really needed some national standards or some national something. But let me pause, and I'm just going to pose a question that we will come back to later in the course, which is, how come it happened? For all the years, I mean, people worry about dirty air and dirty water. This isn't a new concern. There's a very old act that forbids discharge of anything into the navigable waters of the United States. It's been ignored since it was written in the 19th century. But pollution wasn't discovered in 1970. Republican president signed the Clean Air Act amendments and created EPA in 1970. And there's a historical answer, the events that led up to it, but I'd like you to think about the fundamental question, is what turned the politics from absolutely nothing going on at the federal level to a new agency with strong mandates? Don't answer that question. We're going to do that. We're going to do it later. You're going to say Earth Day, and I'm going to say, that's right. And then we're going to say, where did Earth Day come from? So, we've got EPA, but as the case says, I mean, this comes down to policymakers like numbers. What the law said, these are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So one of EPA's jobs is to say, how clean must the air be everywhere in the United States? And you could imagine doing that in two different ways. You could imagine doing those kinds of damage numbers, like damages at different levels of air quality, and look at the costs of attaining different levels of air quality. Do the maximize benefits minus cost. What the law told EPA to do, however, was to protect human health with an adequate margin of safety. Why do you think they did that? as opposed to good old cost-benefit analysis, which every economist would tell them they should have done. And that law has been in effect since 1970, with every economist saying that doesn't make any sense. Take a guess. Somebody who hasn't spoken yet. Rachel, what do you think?
Politics.
Well, politics, but in what kind of politics?
I mean, in the sense that, you know, the president is creating this agency that's going to be in charge of this. He doesn't want to be related to them, allowing them to do a cost-benefit analysis.
But he has to do an analysis. He has to protect human health with an adequate margin of safety, and that analysis will be challenged. It'll be challenged by industry. It'll be challenged by the environmentalists. So you don't just make up the numbers. You have to show that you're protecting human health, and you have to put in an adequate margin of safety.
Yeah, but it sounds a lot better, like with the EPA, I forgot what the exact number, it's like 1 in every 10,000 or 1 in every 100,000.
Okay.
Or like different risk factors depending on what it is. But that sounds like, oh, like only 1 out of every 100,000 people is going to get cancer versus, you know, we're saying you getting cancer is worth X amount of money to us.
I think it's the optics. I think that's right. This assumes that there is some level below which you're safe and above which you're not safe. And if we just get a little bit below that low level, we're all safe. The evidence, as far as I know, on all these pollutants is it's smooth. There is no threshold. The law presumes a threshold because that's easier to talk about. And then internally you can say, well, we'll use a 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million or something like that. And then you can say, we're protecting human health. You don't have to stand up and say, valuing a human life at $6 million, ... I think it is the optics, and I think everybody who's thought about this understands that this is an illogical criterion. It means as you get better and better at measuring things, you have to set tighter and tighter standards because you detect human health effects at lower and lower concentrations, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's kind of inevitable and kind of artificial. Why not just use a price? So why not, instead of setting standards, this is an example from a graph from the reading. Suppose that, and it deals with a very simple case. Suppose that here's the marginal cost of producing gasoline, let us say, and there's the demand. So this would be the equilibrium with no regulation. And Viscusi says, well, suppose we know the damages per gallon of gasoline produced is given by the distance between these two curves. So we tax the production of gasoline. Again, a simple model. We suppose that's the problem. We put a tax equal to this amount here. Then the equilibrium is at the point where production cost plus the marginal value of damages equals the market price. You don't want to produce less because the total cost, production plus damages, is less than the amount the market's willing to pay. You don't want to produce more because the total cost on the margin, total cost for additional units, exceeds what the market's willing to pay. So you impose the marginal cost of damages as a price. Everything is swell. Economists are happy. And you've used the price system. Why might you not want to do that? Well, maybe you do. Why would that be hard? Let me just start there. Part of the reason you don't do it is the optics. Again, you'd rather say we're protecting human health than we're imposing a marginal tax of 60 cents a gallon to reflect the value of human life lost. That's not a great headline. But suppose you could find a way to disguise it. Suppose you just do it. This is the charge. Yeah.
Well, if you're going to tax, say, coal more than you would tax oil for having higher damages, there's also reasons to tax oil more than coal because oil is imported and coal is domestic. And so,
okay.
How do you?
We'll do all the arithmetic. We'll figure out the marginal value of reduced energy security. We'll figure out the marginal value of CO2 emissions, and we'll figure out the marginal value of, marginal cost rather, of little bitty particulates that get in your lung and kill you. And we'll just add them up.
I mean, then you're really getting into the optics of showing that, like, how much you're valuing a human life in comparison to, like
But even if you could, well, I mean, economists all love this. You do have the optics problem. The other problem you got to is that's hard. That's hard, right? Because you saw that range of damages for coal-fired power plants, because that reflects where they are. So you'd want to do this calculation at least for every coal-fired power plant, every gas-fired power plant, and oh, by the way, every car. Because the damages depend on where you drive and how far you drive. So you'd want to have taxes for everything. Now, as an economist, that's little short of paradise. But as a practical matter, that's really hard. That's really hard. So what you get instead, there are prices occasionally. We'll talk about some systems that are price-driven, where it's easier. Suppose you're worried about climate. Well, to a first approximation, carbon dioxide goes in the air, carbon dioxide mixes globally. You don't care where it comes from. You could have a single price for carbon dioxide. Mercury from coal-fired power plants, the damages depend on where the plant is. So if you're going to do prices, you're going to have to do different prices. That's hard. Sometimes, you know, it's not quite right that it doesn't matter where it comes from, but it's close enough. David?
I mean, it's only really hard if you want to do it right? So like what the EPA does now is they set some standard of, you know, like how much pollution you can give out, but they just kind of pick the limit arbitrarily, and then.
Well, they do two things.
Depending on where it is too. 'Cause, like,
They do two things that we talked about, that the case talks about. They do other things as well, but the two things the case talks about is they set air quality standards. And they say everywhere in the country the air has to meet these certain standards. Well, you know, you could say, gee, it makes sense to let the air be dirtier in Los Angeles because it's really hard to clean it in Los Angeles. You can argue about whether that makes sense, but they don't do that. The other thing they do is they set standards, and they let the states figure out how to do that. Right? That's, look, Ohio's got to be clean, Illinois' got to be clean, figure out what to do. If you can find a way to minimize cost, even if you want to price stuff to do it, you, the states, figure out how to do it. We'll check your plan to see if it's going to work, but you give us a plan. That's not terrible. Not great, but it's not terrible. Then the other thing they do is they set standard, that the case mentions, is they set standards for new power plants. And those are the same everywhere. And you can argue, yes, no, is that the right thing to do? But it's better than you tell me where you're going to put the plant, I'll tell you, I'll calculate the tax, because that's hard. I mean, a lot of what goes on here is you have two imperfect approaches. And I'm just saying that while this is really a textbook ideal, it's hard. And while what EPA actually does isn't very good from a textbook point of view, it sort of works, particularly the air standards. You know, to say the air's got to be as, a lot of us would say, look, Los Angeles is really hard to clean up. Let them be dirty. And of course, that's practically what happens because it's been impossible to clean LA to meet national standards. But at least the principle is, no, if you move to LA, you're entitled to clean air. So nobody's doing it perfectly. The question is, which of the imperfect methods is A, workable, and B, reasonable? And all I'm saying is that you don't want to get caught up in the beauty of this without thinking about the complexity of doing it really right. Now you could say, all right, if I'm concerned about acid rain in the east, then I will act as if it doesn't matter where sulfur dioxide goes up into the air. Does it matter? Yes, it matters. Does it matter a lot? Well, not so much within certain bounds. So yeah, it's not quite right, but I'll use that assumption. It'll let me do something I couldn't do otherwise. Well, it does matter who the rain is falling on. Let's hold this for about 4 weeks, and then I want to go into that in detail. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I mean, I had a question then. How do you handle like competing factors? Like something that jumps to my mind is like farming. They use like pesticides or like ammonia fertilizers that get into like the water, and them not using those like reduces food production. What do you have if you have an increased environmental risk of dying? Like on the other side, you also have an increased risk of more expensive food or not enough food or things like that, where both problems kind of.
Well, actually, just there's a little off track. That turns out to be hard. We control. This is not, of course, about water pollution. I don't want to spend much time on it, but we control point sources. So if you have that mill over there, EPA will limit, or the state will limit. I'm not sure how that works. But we'll limit what you can put in the water. If you have a farm, that's called non-point source. You get runoff. You can imagine, in theory, doing cost-benefit calculations about comparing increases in food production costs with ecosystem damage, which is largely what you're getting. You're getting phosphates and other nutrients in the water that damage ecosystems and such, as well as increased cleanup costs downstream. And that might tell you what level of fertilizer use is optimal, or what certain products should and shouldn't be used. Enforcement is a little tough. So we really don't control non-point source water pollution very well in this country. And I was involved in discussions in Washington 20 years ago now about, can we think about how to do this? And it's just a head scratcher, because you really don't want the black helicopters over every farm. But, you know, what's the alternative? So let me move along here. So we've talked about a number of these things. Oh, one of the other things, now let me just go to the next. So this is EPA. This is going, it's November 1974. What's just happened? Why do we all of a sudden care about energy, Scott? You are Scott. You're not Scott. You don't have a name card. He's Scott.
Sorry.
Who are you pretending to be today?
Jean.
Jean, okay. Okay.
Oil prices.
Huh? Oil prices. What did they do?
Embargo, OPEC.
OPEC imposed an embargo. It didn't keep oil from getting to us, but the prices went way up. So Nixon, all of a sudden we talk about, we're very threatened. The Arab countries wouldn't ship to us. We got oil. It doesn't matter. Oil, the tankers go to sea. The tankers go where the tankers go. People buy them at sea and redirect them. So we got oil. But Nixon says we need to be independent by 1980. So first question is, what's energy independence do for you? And is energy independence the same thing as energy security? And how important is it, if it's important? Reactions. Was that the right goal? Was that a right goal? Forget the fact that we failed miserably. Was that worth spending money on? A lot of money. And if so, why? And if not, why not? Fire away.
So if you want to be energy independent, it is when you are not going to import any energy sources from other countries, but at the same time, if any global energy crisis happened in the world, you will still be affected because you are only energy independent, but other products that you are importing from other countries still depends on the energy prices for these countries.
Well, everybody get that? The argument is that if there is a major energy crisis, even if we're not importing any oil, which is what matters, we'll be affected. And you're saying we'll be affected because we will import things from countries that are affected, import other things. We'll also export to countries that may have trouble buying. But also, I mean, you saw the diagrams for Western Europe. These are long-term allies. Our policy will be affected if suddenly, suppose Russia turns off the gas pipeline. Do we just say to our European friends and allies, buy some wool socks? It's going to get cold. No. Our policy is affected. So one argument is, even if you're energy independent, you don't live behind a wall. Any other thoughts? Agree, disagree?
We're really good at producing coal, so we don't necessarily want to be running independently on coal because it's pollutes more. So
Okay, so it matters how you become independent. Okay. Good point. There's a trade-off. There may be a trade-off. If you have nice, cheap natural gas, maybe not so much, but yeah.
Consideration for energy security, like if we decide to become energy dependent by relying on nuclear, and that makes us vulnerable to an attack at a nuclear plant, for example.
Security has multiple dimensions, so you might be vulnerable to terrorist attacks on nuclear plants the way you wouldn't necessarily be vulnerable if, say, you're getting oil from Canada by pipeline. Also, it may depend who you're getting your energy from. Yeah, Max, I'll go back.
Just on the security, looking at that, I've always thought like energy independence doesn't necessarily imply security for the nation as a national interest. We're the largest importer of oil in the world. We stop importing oil from countries like Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East, and they might not be so happy to help us out if Israel goes south.
That's an interesting hypothetical. Yeah, good point though. Good point. There are a lot of other connections. I can't read it. Could be James. Okay.
If it costs too much to be energy independent, it would probably really hurt the economy.
Could be too expensive to do. Okay. Actually, let me give you two scenarios. One, all of our oil is we have the same total energy use that we have now. All of our oil is imported. We import 5 barrels a day. The other case is we're energy independent. We use twice as much oil as we do today. So one case we have no imports, in the other case we have all imports. In which case are we more secure? Which case are we less vulnerable? Let me put it that way. Lots of oil, all domestic, versus a little bit of oil, all imported. What are the risks? What are the risks you worry about? Yeah.
If you import, I guess like if there's multiple sources and there's more negotiation, whereas if you're all self-sufficient in a sense, if something were to go wrong there, do you have nowhere to go with it?
Well, I didn't say there was nobody else in the world. I just said all of our oil is domestic. There's still tankers, there are still ports, there's still the world market. Manuel?
If all the oil is domestic, we might run out in the next few years.
We might. Let's assume we got lucky. We got lucky, we have a lot of it. Jake?
Much more expensive. It's kind of like the same issue we have with sugars, because.
All right, let me make a nice hypothetical, same cost. Okay. We're producing at world prices. Let me lead you in the direction I want to go. Suppose the world price doubles. In which scenario do we get hurt worse? A little bit of oil all imported, a lot of oil all domestic.
I guess if world prices were doubled, it would be hurt less if all of our oil was.
Oh, so you'd separate our prices from the world prices? Oh, I didn't say it was separate. I just said we produced it all. Britain was self-sufficient in oil for a long time.
We would export it, so I guess it would hurt us less.
We might.
Because
What would happen?
We would export our oil because we'd make more money.
It's traded. So wouldn't you expect the domestic price to equal the world price in both cases?
Yes.
Okay. So we use a lot of oil, the price doubles.
We should use
versus a little bit of oil and the price doubles.
Yeah, using less oil.
Using less oil would make us less vulnerable to that shock.
Right.
So the amount of oil matters as much as where it comes from. The difference is, do the checks go to Saudi Arabia or do they go to Texas or now North Dakota? But if you drive a car, it doesn't much matter to you. It's still a doubling of your cost. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's the case, but during the crisis, I think it became important not only for strategic political reasons, but also because the public perception changed completely. Because Americans never really had faced an overall energy crisis. It's not just about price. People would go to the gas stations and they couldn't get gas, right? So there was actually a supply.
Well, that was in '79, and that's actually because I was taking a long road trip during that, and that was in fact because of government regulation. We decided we'd hold the domestic price down. and that made it hard to get gas. People panicked. But let me hold off. We'll come to that. We'll come to that later. So, and I'm going to answer this one just in the interest of moving along. Project independence. Independence is a nice sounding goal, but it's not necessarily, if you think it through, and there's a nice piece, recommended piece on the list about this, not necessarily the most important goal. You might want to use less oil, period, since oil is very volatile. Okay, it's 75. I'll answer this too because we're moving slowly. Oil prices have been pretty stable since it's only been a year. Here's the choice: CAFE standards on cars or a gasoline tax. Which do you do? Which do you do? You're on President Ford's Council of Economic Advisors. In fact, one of my teachers was on President Ford's Council of Economic Advisors. Which do you think he advised Ford to support? Standards for motor vehicles or taxes on gasoline? And why? Which would you support and why? Brendan?
He probably supported standards on regulation because taxes are fairly unpopular, where standards kind of affect the...
So the political argument would be you can't say tax or somebody will shoot you. Put that to one side for a moment, and we'll assume you could actually say the word tax out loud. There was a time when you could in this country. Yeah?
If you impose a tax, then everybody has to pay equally, and there's no incentive to buy your cars or make your cars better, more efficient. And in the long run, that won't be.
Well, the more expensive gasoline is, the more expensive a gas guzzler is for you to own. So you'd expect gasoline prices to change vehicle purchases, right? So it doesn't remove the incentive for me to decide what to buy. From General Motors' point of view, sure, if you'll buy a guzzler, I'll make a guzzler. The tax would work through consumers. Andreas?
I think it depends on what your goal is specifically to do. But if your goal is to like reduce pollution, for example, I would think that would make more sense to put tax, because that would, as we said, in terms of like making engines more efficient, I think the gas price itself would lead to more efficient cars, because if gasoline price is very expensive, you want to get cars that are more efficient, like we have in airplanes right now and stuff like that. You will have airplanes or engines that are more efficient, so you can use less. And I think that it's fair for an issue like pollution, where everybody's affected, to have everybody pay for it, as opposed to have only people who buy specific.
What are the different, good points, what are the different effects on the cost of driving once you own a car?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, so if you have, with the CAFE standards, basically if you have a more efficient engine, you might be also encouraged to drive more.
Driving's cheaper. Yeah.
It's cheaper as opposed to like taking the bus or something.
I was going to let Julian give that answer, but you probably have another point.
Well, I was going to talk about like where the cost actually went, like if you instituted a motor fuels tax or a CAFE program to make more efficient cars and whatnot, because motor fuels are relatively safe, like inelastic thing. You still have to drive to work, you still have to like go to school, etc., etc., etc. But if you have like a motor fuels tax, that'll probably be passed on to something like the manufacturer, and then they'll try and pass it on to you.
Oh, sure. Motor fuels tax will raise the cost of gasoline at retail. That's what it's supposed to do. Yeah.
Who is it passed on to more? Like, who will be taxed at that point? I mean,
First approximation, it's the consumer, right? If it costs more to make efficient cars, the consumer will pay. If gasoline prices rise, the consumer will pay. So on that level, it's probably a wash. The question is the impact on incentives. Let me pose you one. Suppose I have an old gas guzzler. I have an old car that gets lousy mileage. You do a gas tax or you do a CAFE standard. What are the impacts on me? And what do I do?
your car might cost more initially.
No, I own it. It's an old car. It's a 1966 Pontiac Bonneville. It gets 2 miles to the gallon, but the sound is good, okay? you've imposed a CAFE standard on 2011 model cars, or you've doubled the gas tax. What do I do in those two cases? Maybe I scrap the car, right? Maybe I scrap the car earlier because it's more expensive to run than a new car. So I do want to cover a little more ground. Most economists would say you'd want the gas tax because it affects driving, it affects all drivers, and ultimately you expect it to affect motor vehicle design because you've changed buying incentives. The counter is people react slowly to price changes. You might not get the effect you want right away. The politics are not as good. Yeah. Scott.
Excuse me. I think there's a common modern day example of back in, I think, 2008 or 2009 when gas prices went up to like $4 a gallon. Then people's buying preferences did change a lot. A lot of people started buying smaller cars, more compact vehicles, and SUV sales were really hit hard. So I think that kind of shows that, although, I mean,
there are a lot of papers on this. They come to the conclusion that there certainly is an effect. How big the effect is, how long-lasting the effect is, a lot of debate. But certainly in 1980, when prices spiked, there was a big shift to economy cars. What else might we have done to use less petroleum besides either a gas tax or a CAFE standard? Yeah.
The carpool program.
Carpool program, getting warm, yep.
Public transportation.
Subsidizing public transportation is sort of a European answer to it, which is instead of getting the cars more efficient, get the people out of the cars. And there was a little bit of discussion of that, but that's not terribly popular, particularly in spread out western cities. If you compare Boston, which is fairly dense, with a Los Angeles or a Denver or a Salt Lake City, public transportation's tough because the cities were built for cars. So it's a long-standing debate. I'm going to move quickly. President Carter's packing his bags. What's happened to oil prices? It's late 1980. Do you remember the hostage rescue? You don't remember the hostage rescue. The hostage non-rescue in Tehran. Oil prices spiked. So now we come to coal, because the proposal is, look, we know how to make liquid fuels out of coal. Germany did it in the Second World War. People have been experimenting with it since the 20s. This is not magic. Processes can get better, catalysts can be improved, but basically we know how to make liquid fuels out of coal. We're sitting on a ton of coal. A ton understates it. We're sitting on lots of coal. We are the Saudi Arabia of coal. Why are we fooling around here? Why don't we do a synthetic fuels industry in this country as they did in Germany, as they did in Japan, as they did and are still doing in South Africa, and make liquid fuels from coal and use American coal? So, good idea. And climate was not on the table at this point. So climate's not a consideration for Carter.
Process. What I remember from Germany doing it during World War II, it was their last ditch effort because they were basically isolated from the rest of the world.
When they got cut off from Romanian oil, yeah.
Right, they had to fuel their war machine by themselves, and that was their only option was to turn. I think they exhausted all the coal supplies too.
Well, they made a dent. They made a dent. So one thing you want to think about, and we talked about this, is, it might be expensive. So one thing you might want to know, and the answer to that question is, well, what's this stuff going to cost per gallon? Can you give me a number? And if it's 5 times the market price, maybe not. And if it's 1.5 times the market, well, we're in 1980. And in 1980, oil prices had gone up like that, and all the forecasts called on them to continue to rise. It's a great story of how forecasts extrapolate. Every published forecast said that they were going to continue to rise. In the event, they collapsed. But in any case, you might want to know how the costs would compare. Anything else you might want to think about? Scott?
If
The synthetic fuels industry starts off well and then the oil price drops, you then lose that industry that you invested so much in?
So you might want to think about risks in addition to just what's it cost. Given the history of the oil price, given the fact that 1980 is a peak, historic, maybe it's not really going to continue to rise as everybody says it is. Maybe there is just some chance that the Iranian situation will settle down and prices will come back. So you'd want to worry about the cost and you'd want to worry about the risk. Anything else you might want to consider? Yeah.
You want to worry about like the pollution in terms of like how it relates to oil.
Yeah, that's where I was going. You might actually, and this is in 1980, climate's not on the table, but local pollution, all kinds of other pollution is. So you might ask the question, what's this process look like environmentally? Then, of course, you would factor in energy security, and you'd reach a decision. You might also ask, are these processes really mature? But in any case, you might or might not advise. I would say opinion was quite mixed on this. This wasn't going to be a government industry. This was going to be a public-private partnership. They were going to help private industry develop, not build a government industry. So it wasn't a nutty design, and it wasn't a nutty idea given all the coal. But a lot of these questions that you raised, I don't think were adequately answered at the time. So now it's 1986. Reagan is president. What happened to oil prices? I just told you they collapsed. How well has the Synthetic Fuels Corporation performed? Well, badly? Matthew's doing the thumbs down. Okay. Yep.
About like 60% of the ethanol plants in the U.S. closed by mid-1980s, so pretty poorly.
Well, this wasn't ethanol. This was, well, some was ethanol, actually, yeah. So, should he shut it down? Yeah, you should shut it down. You shut it down. And the facts, you'd want to have the same facts we had before. But here's the hypothetical that I find intriguing. Suppose oil prices collapse, but the thing had actually worked in the sense that the plants were working. And it cost twice as much, but it was domestic. Would you subsidize it? Is reduced use of petroleum-based fuels worth it, Sam?
I wouldn't necessarily subsidize it. I would say, like, at that point, what you do is you stick it in your back pocket as like a safety card, and also you kind of invest in trying to bring the cost down more and increase the efficiency. So in the case that oil prices jump again, then you're like, oh, we have this card in our back pocket.
So you try to mothball the plants, basically. Do a little R&D, mothball the plants, see if you can upgrade them. Not bad.
I would say it depends on the domestic impact, because if you're going to go with synthetic fuels and you have like an area the size of Texas blended completely with sugar cane.
No, these are coal-based, basically. So it's strip mining in Wyoming, you know. Nobody lives there, it's okay. You don't want to look at photos of strip mines. Okay, this would actually be a more interesting decision. You'd want to think about, you'd worry about employment, by the way, if you just if you're a politician and you just built this industry. And you say, oh, gee, too bad. Oil prices collapse, you die. The political pressure to save a government-sponsored enterprise would be significant. And you'd worry about the environmental impact of running it and shutting it down. The cost of subsidizing down to world prices would be the equivalent of the cost of imports based on this. That's a lot of money. You probably wouldn't want to do that. It's climate. What's happened to oil? It's 2012, here we are. What's happened to U.S. import dependence? It's gone up. What's happened to CAFE standards? Not much, yes? Not much. The case should have mentioned, in fact, that It a little bit overstates the inaction, so let me correct that. There was a 2007 law passed and signed by President Bush that called for increases. The Bush administration proposed increases. The Obama administration finalized them for the next several model years and has agreement with manufacturers. So they're moving now. But from the mid-1980s until late in the last decade, nothing happened. How come? Rachel.
Well, it got cheap again. It stayed cheap for a while, and then the economy picked up, and it started to go up, but then the economy crashed again, so then the oil prices went back down, and it became less of an issue.
So energy just really wasn't on the table, and the auto companies were being hammered by imports and other things to worry about. It's always, and you know, from the point of view of the auto industry, if you can keep it off the table, you want it off the table. People like large, fast cars. All the R&D went into performance. Engines got more efficient, lots more efficient, but they also got bigger. And cars got bigger, and we all drove SUVs, and we're fat and happy, at least as I recall. What's new? 2012. What's the new issue? Just one word. Just one word. Okay, how about a hand? Logan, what do you think? No. Back in the back. Climate! Hey, there we go. Climate. Climate became an agenda item in Washington in the late 1980s. In 1992 rather, most of the world ratified the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm not going to say something about climate. We have with us one of the foremost climate scientists in the world who is going to kibitz and tell me when I say something wrong, which I probably will in the next 5 minutes. Professor Solomon, a recent addition to the MIT faculty, I am flattered that she's here, and we'll see how this goes. I'm just going to say a little bit about climate. We'll come back to it, perhaps when she's out of town, and I can get away with more. I just want to say a little bit today. We're going to come back to it. This is more political background and just one conceptual point. This is the hardest policy problem I've ever encountered, and it's hard for a variety of reasons. It's hard because it's a global problem. It would require significant actions by rich and poor countries. You saw the differences in energy systems. All of those different energy systems would have to do something different over the next 20 years to really make, and beyond, to make a dent. And inconveniently, we lack a world government. So if you think it's hard to get agreement in Congress, you can pass a law, people can be compelled. Internationally, you can't do it. Another issue that makes it hard is the timescales, right? Climate is an intergenerational issue. CO2, you think order of magnitude, it's not a half-life, but an order of magnitude, half-life of a century, sort of a half-life of a century. There will be a lot of it around. That's, you know, Abraham Lincoln's CO2 is still up there in quantity. We would need to do things today to benefit our great-grandchildren. This is not always an easy sell. Costs today, benefits way down the line. And another thing that's conceptually hard, and we're going to play with this when we do the climate negotiation exercise, is it's hard for people to get their head around the dynamics involved in CO2. And we'll do just a 3-minute exercise to make this point. So I'm going to ask you to think through what a picture would look like. So here is the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. Just imagine this scenario. It's risen up to 2000, to 2010, 12, and suppose it gradually rises and stabilizes. In fact, this is pretty aggressive. It stabilizes at 400 parts per million, which is quite aggressive. And here is the rate at which it's removed from the atmosphere by natural processes. Let's just keep life simple. Suppose that rate is constant. Now think in your head or draw a picture. So what I gave you there was concentration in the atmosphere. A scenario. This is sort of actual data. This is suppose. This is sort of actual data for emissions. Suppose that's the rate at which it's removed from the atmosphere. Right? So this is gigatons per year. These are rates. That was a stock. These are flows. What would the emissions path have to look like for this graph to be consistent with the prior one? Okay, just don't answer, just form an answer in your head. Got it? Got the picture? Got the answer? Has to look like that. It has to come down to equal removals at the end, or it doesn't stabilize. Right? Stuff coming out has to equal stuff coming in. Water flowing into the bathtub has to equal water flowing out of the bathtub. Now, I assume you all got this right, because you're all smart. Lots of people don't. This is a study published in Science that used Harvard and MIT graduate students. You guys are all smarter than graduate students, I understand that. 75% of the sample didn't get emissions equal to removals at the end. They didn't draw a trajectory that hit at the end. This is a little tougher, violating conservation of mass. That's a little tricky, but over half asserted, yeah, you can be stable. You don't have to get to the end. You don't have to equalize at the end. Well, these are Harvard and MIT graduate students. Lawyers have even more trouble with this. Nothing against lawyers. Some of them once were Harvard and MIT graduate students. So this is missed a lot. And it's a thing that makes the negotiation process complicated. The exercise we're going to do here is one that's been run through with actual negotiators with the purpose, developed here by my colleague John Sturman, with the purpose of getting them to understand at an intuitive level the consequence of those dynamics. For this purpose, you think of the atmosphere as a bathtub. The height of the bathtub, the height of the water in the bathtub is the concentration. Emissions are what comes out of the faucet, and removals is what goes down the drain. If you're worried about local air pollution that stays in the atmosphere for hours, you just worry about emissions. You reduce emissions and you got it. For this problem, that doesn't do it. A sharp cut in emissions is consistent with the atmosphere having more and more greenhouse gases. That's different. That complicates the problem. Okay, so I'll just a little more history. Are there questions about that? Yeah.
Is the removal rate proportional to the concentration of?
I don't know. Okay. Is it? Is the removal rate proportional to the concentration? Sort of.
It can be.
It can be. I just did a constant rate to make the exercise simpler. You could imagine it rising over time slightly. The same thing would have to be true. You'd have to get emissions down to removals to stabilize.
But if as you pollute or emit more CO2, if the removal rate is rising,
you will stabilize at a higher level.
Yeah, which is also not good, but
400 is pretty aggressive. Okay, a little bit of history, and then we will chat today. So just, again, this is a setup to what we'll be doing in 2 weeks. Since the '92 convention, there have been 72 meetings of the parties to that convention. The third meeting produced the Kyoto Protocol, which obliged rich countries, those rich countries that ratified it, to reduce emissions. Many ratified We didn't, and President George W. Bush rejected the protocol in 2001, and so we are the big emitter not playing. There have been lots more meetings. The Copenhagen meeting was widely publicized. The most recent one was in South Africa. 17 conferences, yeah, most recently in Durban. You're going to be a conference of the parties beginning at the end of this month, and you're going to solve this, okay? But for now, it's 2012, and we're President Obama. What do you do about coal? We have a lot of coal, it's dirty. Should we do more of it, less of it? This is not a right answer question. This is a what do you think question. You surely have opinions. Yes?
Start with retrofitting and using point source capture, which is getting reasonably effective. I mean, even the MIT, well, I guess that's gas, but you can make these coal plants better and better, and that reduces your emissions.
Well, you can. We haven't done it at commercial scale. You can imagine capturing, if you're worried about local pollution, yeah, you can scrub them and make them cleaner. If you're worried about carbon dioxide, you can take carbon dioxide out of flue gas. It's not cheap, and then you got to put it someplace. So you can do it, but it may be quite expensive. Yeah.
You can retire the really old, inefficient coal plants and replace them with maybe natural gas plants.
So you would say the answer is you would favor moving off coal.
For the ones that are inefficient, they're older.
Okay.
Rather than all of them.
Matthew?
Although the CTL plants weren't successful when they're created, it's possible that we have the technology now to make them more successful and less expensive.
Which plant?
The coal to
liquids?
Yeah. Just because they said they polluted less than coal to electricity does.
When burned. About the same amount of CO2 life cycle, but they burn clean.
So that might be a more efficient way to use coal.
So you might revisit the coal to liquids question. Again, we're putting shale gas off the table for this discussion. You might revisit coal to liquids to see if we can do it better. Yeah. Anybody else? A thought? Yeah, Scott?
I heard of an experimental technology that uses the carbon dioxide from burning coal to create cement, which is also really a carbon-intensive process. So looking at processes like that are similar to that and seeing if you can develop them to a commercial scale.
So you'd spend some money on R&D to see if we can find clean ways to use coal rather than give up on it because we've got so much of it. And we touched on that one. Electric vehicles? You electric vehicle fans? Is that a way to use the coal? Brendan?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to move towards electric vehicles because we can increase our grid size by adding additional plants. In terms of we can add natural gas or nuclear plants to make up the difference in cost and oil.
So you think electric vehicles are a good thing to explore at least? Cost an issue?
With projected rises in oil prices, not so much. Not as much as they would be if they were low.
I need to put up a graph of the forecasts of oil prices in 1980, which were just amazing and all wrong. But you know, I mean, you're right. If I'm betting money, I'm betting in the long run up, but not down, particularly with the rise of China. Okay, 30 seconds of free for all before we break. Any other policies that we haven't talked about that we should have talked about that will deal with this thing? Have you a silver bullet? We've all been looking for one.
I'm extremely pro-nuclear energy, but I understand that it's extremely expensive, and one of the reasons it's so expensive is because of all the regulation that covers it. I would like to reform regulation. I think that we move towards a long-term nuclear solution, maybe use natural gas as an interim solution. It's easier and cheaper to convert to a natural gas system.
Well, there have been some reforms to nuclear regulation, like design licensing instead of plant licensing. But one issue is Fukushima. Okay. I know. One last thing I'd like you to do. Could you, for 1 second, close your eyes? Close your eyes, because I don't want people looking at each other. Those of you who think of yourselves as libertarians, small government, Republican types, please raise your hands. Okay, down please. Those of you who think of yourselves as kind of liberal, democratic, I don't want the poor to starve, raise your hands. Okay, you're going to try to put the Republicans on one side of this debate and the Democrats on the other. We're going to have a bit of a debate next Tuesday between two opposing views of the role of government. And I just wanted to see how you divide. There are a lot of agnostics. Democrats outnumber Republicans. So think about that as you read for next week. Have a good weekend.